Welcome to the inaugural episode of TheBeat podcast. I'm MJ and this is BD. This is a professional basketball-oriented podcast, and it only makes sense that we would be huge basketball fans with all the great college teams around here. But anyway, we hope you guys enjoy this podcast. We're going to try to talk about a lot of current events and also just some really, what we consider at least as interesting things about the NBA. Just to give you guys a little bit of background, we're both from the Cincinnati area. Right now, my favorite team's the Cavs. Obviously, you're not really supposed to jump around the league, but since Cincinnati doesn't technically have a team, I can do that. So I'm pulling for them. So basically you can cancel your cable subscription to ESPN and just tune in to us now. If you like basketball, tune in and subscribe. If you think we have soothing voices, please subscribe. If you don't like basketball and you think we have horrible opinions and do a terrible job, subscribe anyway. And this is BD.
All right. Hello, everyone. So we're from the Cincinnati area, and there aren't very many NBA fans here. We're one of the few, and we're, I'd say, pretty big diehard fans. We'll watch a lot of games and have good conversations. At least we think they're good conversations. So unlike my friend here, I don't flop around on my favorite teams. I've been a Lakers fan.
I don't either, for the record.
A few years ago, he was a big Celtics fan, and that definitely was not good because I've been a Lakers fan since, I think, the late 90s. I guess when I was young, we didn't really have a favorite team. This is like you said, we don't have a local team. Like everyone in the 90s, you like the Bulls, but after Jordan retired...
Best team ever.
Didn't have a favorite one after that, but I did go, since my uncle also likes to watch basketball, I went over to his house, and it was a game on, and it was the Lakers playing. My cousin was watching with us, and I asked her, isn't Shaq supposed to be on the Magic? And she told me that he was traded, and it was, I can't remember who they were playing, but the Lakers were winning, and by at least, let's say, like 15, 20 points. And that was the first time that I saw Kobe Bryant play, and he had a pretty good game. He was obviously pretty young, so I think he had, I don't remember exactly how many points he had, I'd say probably over 20, but he had some pretty cool jump shots that he made, some layups and a dunk here and there, and after that, I was hooked. I was like, well, I think I found my new team and found my new favorite player. So I've been a Lakers fan ever since. And, now that I grew up with the Lakers, I don't ever plan on, changing. Even after Kobe retires, I'm not a Kobe fan. I'm a Lakers fan. So no matter what, I'll stick with them. But I guess the reason I knew about Shaq, even though I wasn't a big fan then since I was pretty young, was from those, if you remember, those of us who were old enough in the 90s when had those arcade games, remember the old school NBA Jam?
Oh, those are crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had one in our area in a Pizza Hut, and whenever my dad and I would go to pick up pizzas, while we'd wait for it, because you didn't have the internet back then where you can just place the order online, have it ready to pick up, so you had to actually go and get the pizza. So when we would wait, bring some quarters, pop them in there, and I guess since I was a Bulls fan, usually I try to play with the Bulls, but end up playing with Magic. And,
well, they were the best rated team in the game, so
sure.
Everybody picked them.
Right. So play against Shaq. So that's how I knew him. But ever since then, fell in love with the Lakers, and Kobe's one of my favorite players all time of Lakers, and so it's kind of...
And hopefully he comes back from his injury and is able to play really well, because he's such a great player.
Sure, yeah. I mean, a lot of people, don't like him, but, you have to respect a great player like that. Same with LeBron now, who, there are a lot of players, people who didn't like him after he went to Miami, but now that he's back in Cleveland, popularity is a lot higher. But even in Miami, though, you have to respect a great player like that, because you look after he left, how much worse they are. There's more factors than just him leaving, but...
Yeah, so we just wanted to give you a brief introduction there and ramble on about basketball. But what we thought would be cool to do for our first podcast is basically talk about the top 10 franchises of all time. And so it doesn't seem like we're just talking out of our butts. We're doing a point system, which has been similarly done. You might have read about them in articles in the past. But this is our point system. BD put it together for us. And we take in a lot of things in factor. But we will also, just because we have the point system, we also have our personal top 10 teams. So we'll sort of compare and contrast how the breakdown of the point system worked compared to what we personally consider the top 10 franchises, and I can tell you more about the point system.
We try to be, as objective as possible, and we've actually been working on it for the past maybe 2-3 weeks. We'd meet up a day or so, spend a few hours together, trying to think of, well, how much should we reward for this category and what should we put more emphasis on. And kind of what we came up with is most of the points you earn, and we did have one category where we deduct some points. So we'll just kind of break down how it works. So you obviously get the most points for winning a championship. We wanted to put as much emphasis on winning, not just in the regular season, but in the playoffs, especially in the finals. So we gave the most points for that, or not up to, but 200 points every time a team won a championship. Then we had 100 points just for making it to the finals because, just look at how good the West has been the last decade or so. Sometimes just making it, to the Western Conference Finals and then being able to beat your opponent there is a big achievement.
Yeah.
And, the teams in the East, you always have at least, 2 or 3 good teams there, sometimes more. They have, the Eastern Conference hasn't obviously been as competitive as the West the last decade or so, but it's not just the decade, we wanted to make this top 10 franchises of all time. So, and we also kind of realized that some franchises haven't been there from the start, like the Spurs, for example. They came in, was it from the ABA?
Yeah, a lot of teams, like the
merger.
Spurs, came from the ABA.
Yeah.
So,
but we try to be as fair as possible. We try to take that into consideration. But this is our first attempt at doing it. So then we also had 50 points for every time you made it into the playoffs, which is not easy to do, and then 2 points for every regular season game won, because even though that'll overall add up to more than 200 points, say, for one championship, but I guess being able to win consistently year after year means something too.
yeah, definitely.
So we had, we didn't want to, there was a lot of discussion and debate with us. Should we make it 1 point, a half a point, 2 points, 3? And we figured, I think 2 is good because there were a lot of franchises who've been around for a while, but they don't always win very many games every season. So we wanted to reward those that have consistently, for many decades been able to have successful seasons. And then we did up to 500 points for franchise players. So, and what we meant there is, those are the guys who you buy tickets, even if your team sucks, you still want to go see them. Like this year, the Lakers, for example. When Kobe was in there in the beginning of the season, right, you would still want to go and watch him play. He might have a pretty good night, or, when he passed Jordan on the all-time scoring list, people wanted to go see that. They wanted to see him, score those points and make it past that list, or Jordan himself when he was on the Bulls. You just wanted to go sometimes just see him play, or if you're the opposing team, right, and Jordan comes to your town, even if your team sucks, you still want to go see him. So so that's kind of what we meant by franchise player. Those guys that make a big difference and kind of alter the course of a team, or like Tim Duncan, for example.
Yeah.
Not having him on the Spurs, they wouldn't be as good as they've been the last, decade and a half, 2 decades almost.
Yeah, Mr. Iron Man, Tim Duncan.
Sure. And then we did up to 1,000 points for a few things like repeating. So they've only been in the NBA a few franchises in the NBA history that have been able to like defend their championship. So we thought like some teams have been able to do it on multiple occasions, like the Bulls in the 90s, being able to defend their titles on multiple occasions, more than once. They had the first three-peat, and another one. Really, it's only been three or so teams that have been able to do something like that. So not every franchise can say that they've had that opportunity or ability to do that. So we wanted to reward those teams that did that. Another category was, and we'll talk about this more as we talk about the individual franchises themselves, up to 1,000 points for intangibles, which could be a whole host of things like, say, for example, being dominant for a long time, like the Spurs. I think this will be their 17th or 18th year in a row that they make it into the playoffs.
Wow.
That's pretty impressive. There have only been a handful of teams that have had long stretches like that. I think the Lakers might have had at one point like 17 in a row. If the Spurs, not if, but they are in the playoffs this year, this might be their 18th. I'd have to check the stats, but it doesn't matter exactly. But this year, when they make it into the playoffs, they'll surpass that. There've only been like one or two more teams that have had slightly longer stretches. So things like that we're calling, intangibles. And we'll talk about that again more when we get into the actual discussion. And then the one category where we did subtract points was up to 500 points deducted from a franchise if you've had a losing record over the entire time you've been in the NBA. So say like you've been around since the 60s and you've won 1,500 games but you lost 1,700 games. So we thought that, we needed somewhere to kind of deduct something from a franchise, because that's not a top 10 franchise, shouldn't have that. Or if you're in the top 10 because you've done well in other things, to kind of separate you and put you closer to the bottom or where you truly deserve to be, we figured we could use that to kind of put teams where we feel they need to be in. So I guess with that said, MJ can start with the 10th team on the list.
Yeah, so before we go through the point system, I just thought it would be a good idea to give you our personal top 10, just to give you an impression of what we think. Hopefully give ourselves some credit as NBA analysts. So I don't really have an order. It's just a general, I would say, order. I think unquestionably you're always going to find that the Boston Celtics and the Los Angeles Lakers are going to be number 1 and 2, and you could argue either way there. Chicago Bulls, San Antonio Spurs, New York Knicks. New York is crazy for the Knicks no matter how bad they do. So, sort of just the way it is. They really haven't. They were great in the Ewing era in the 90s, but the greatest era was with Willis Reed. Phil Jackson, that was the team he was on when they won the championship. Detroit Pistons. I put the Brooklyn Nets on there. A lot of people would probably disagree with that. The reason I did that is the Nets have just had a long franchise history. They were previously the New Jersey Nets. Before that, they were the New York Nets. Dr. J is an icon from that franchise. And when I think in past NBA, I think of the Nets. Also, the Philly 76ers, Houston Rockets. The 10th spot, there's so many great franchises in the NBA that could be there. I put the Warriors, the Golden State Warriors. They're a team a lot of people forget about, but they had Wilt Chamberlain in his early years when he scored 100 points. They've actually won 3 championships. I believe, if memory serves me correct, only one technically counts as an NBA championship. They've had Rick Barry, a great NBA player. John Barry, his son. Both of his sons played NBA basketball. John Barry is an NBA announcer you've probably heard of. So that's my top 10, and we'll see how it stacks up against our point system. And
yeah, I mostly agree with the list. Always Lakers, Celtics. 1, 2, Bulls, Spurs. Definitely should be right up there. The only team that from the list that I would definitely take out would be the Nets. And replace them with the Heat. They haven't historically been good, but they have 3 championships, which when we go through our list, there aren't very many franchises that have 3 championships or more.
That's true.
So they, and then making it to the finals. And I'm not a Miami Heat fan. That's not why I put them on there. Just because they did make it to the finals 4 times in a row. That's a pretty impressive feat. Historically, right, they haven't been great, but I would just replace the Nets with Miami. And then, of course, Houston, they had a lot of success in the 90s, when Jordan wasn't there on the Bulls team.
Yeah.
2-year hiatus. And then, definitely the Warriors deserve to be on there. Philly, one of the best. Probably put them in the top 5. So, but I guess after we finish our list, I'll talk a little bit more about mine, like the actual numbers. I think we agree pretty much with almost all the teams on there. I might change one more, but actually it looks, obviously I forgot to mention the Knicks. Yeah, definitely one of the best franchises ever. They have won championships, been to the finals many times, played against the Lakers in a lot of finals.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Anytime you can make it to the finals and play against the top 2 franchises is a good accomplishment. And on multiple occasions too. So we're ready for the list?
Let's
do it. The official list.
All right, so the number 10, we have the Atlanta Hawks, 8,034 total points. Just a brief breakdown. They have 1 championship, 4 finals appearances, 42 playoff appearances, 2,542 regular season games won. And I'll go ahead and throw in there that they had Pistol Pete Maravich in the early part of his years. They had a great team in the 90s with Mookie Blaylock, Dikembe Mutombo, obviously Dominique Wilkins and Spud Webb. They're a good franchise.
Yeah, and I was surprised, to be honest. I never would have... I mean, obviously our point system isn't perfect, and we do plan on... This is our first attempt at it. We do plan on later adding more categories and making a more detailed one. We definitely would like to do that maybe over the summer when there aren't as many interesting things going on in the NBA, like after the draft and everything. We'll have more time instead of just watching games and discussing who's going to win the championship and this and that.
Yeah.
But based off of, we did put, like I said, we did put a lot of thought into this, and I was pretty surprised because we did this to, I think we had a top 18 list of teams, and we kind of put all 18 teams to this test. And and I wanted to kind of work the numbers to see if we could, because my friend likes the Nets, he wanted them to be there, and I wanted to see like Miami, because I really think that a team who's been to the finals 5 times, 3 championships, you think that would deserve to be in the top 10.
Maybe.
But when you what I think helped the Hawks and hurt the Nets and Miami even more was that the amount of regular season games that they won and playoff appearances. And I was pretty surprised. I didn't even really know that they made it to the finals 4 times, which is a pretty good accomplishment. I think a lot of people here say, if you win second place, that's not a good accomplishment because number 1 is everything. But, I mean, if you really think about it, when you just to make it into the Super Bowl, the World Series, the NBA Finals, Stanley Cup Finals, that's a pretty big accomplishment, too.
Definitely.
Because that means you have to beat, 2 or 3 other really good teams. Because in the playoffs, you play the best of the best, right? Or usually it's just, supposed to.
Yeah.
So just to make it to finals, Super Bowl, whatever, it's a good accomplishment. And, 4 times is pretty good.
And also what I like about this point system is the regular season games won really rewards some of the franchises with longevity in the league.
Yeah, that's true.
So
that's what hurts teams like Miami. They haven't been around as long, and we'll try to, in the next time we do this, we'll try to, take that into account more.
Yeah.
So, ready for the next one?
Yeah, and I just gotta say, congrats to Dominique Wilkins for getting a statue. Great player, class act guy. I will say it's a little disappointing that there's some other great players in that franchise's history.
You were bitching about that a lot last week.
Well, I don't want to come off. I like Dominique Wilkins, so I don't want to come off as a Dominique Wilkins hater because he's a good player.
Right? Yeah. You're not. You definitely have a lot of respect for him.
But man, I mean, there's just historically, they've had some really great players. Bob Pettit and Pistol Pete Maravich would be the other two, besides Dominique Wilkins and Dikembe Mutombo, that would probably get the most acknowledgement. And it's just hard for me to not see one of those guys also getting the statue. But you never know; they could.
Sure.
So.
All right. So we're on to number 9, which are the Houston Rockets. And actually, when we did our numbers, this was so close because based off our point system, the Rockets are only 6 points better than our number 10 franchise. So we had the Hawks at 8,034 points. The Rockets are at 8,040 points after we did our point system.
Wow.
And what hurt them, it made them so close, was that the number of regular season games won. Atlanta had a lot more. They won over 2,500 games. Houston won, actually, and all these numbers, forgot to say, were all as of the end of the 2014 season. Okay. So as of last year. So obviously things are a little bit different now, but as of the end of last season, the Rockets had 1,995 games won, and they had 27 playoff appearances, as opposed to the 42 for Atlanta. But what helped them was they had 4 finals appearances, so they were tied there, but 2 championships. And the other thing was, where we rewarded them was in our category of repeating. They were one of a few franchises ever to be able to defend their title. So they won 2 titles, and they won them back-to-back. So we had to give them a lot of points there and say that means, to us, that means more than just winning one and then another one later, another decade or so, being able to repeat. Especially, I think that the 90s were pretty competitive. It's just that, the Bulls were so good, but there were a lot of other, good teams. For them to be able to make it that far in the playoffs and win 2 years in a row, we felt they should be rewarded, and that's what put them slightly above Atlanta and made them our number 9 best franchise of all time.
There's such a good franchise. Hakeem Olajuwon's one of my personal top 10 players from all time. He's a class act, and he's probably, maybe Kareem might beat him out, but as far as skill in the low post, it's hard to think of too many guys better than Hakeem Olajuwon. And, it's really ironic that they never played the Bulls in the finals because...
Yeah, I would like to see that.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, the Bulls won 6 championships in the 90s, from 91 to 93.
This guy will never let you forget.
And then, in 94 and 95, when Michael Jordan retired, Houston won them back-to-back, and then Jordan came back in 96, and they won 3 more. But Houston and the Bulls never met in the finals, and that would have been such a great matchup. Both teams are so good. For those of you who maybe question how good Hakeem Olajuwon was, in one of those championships, he actually played a very young Shaq in the finals.
Swept him.
And personally, Shaq is one of the most dominant players in all time, but for Hakeem to do that was pretty amazing.
Definitely.
Hakeem definitely got the better of him early in his career, and just such a good franchise. They're still good today. They've had Tracy McGrady, Yao Ming, James Harden, a potential MVP is on the team, and of course Dwight Howard. Clyde Drexler, don't want to forget that guy. And my personal favorite player they had for about a season, Scottie Pippen. So, awesome franchise.
Definitely. Yeah, I forgot about all those other great players. Kenny the Jet Smith.
Yep.
Yeah, he was a good player for them. All right, so we'll move on to number 8.
Sure. The Golden State Warriors, we previously talked about them. They got a total of 8,358 points. 3 championships, 6 finals appearances, 29 playoff appearances, a lot of regular season wins at 2,454. Great franchise. Really, their glory days were in the 70s. So a lot of people might not necessarily have the link to how good Golden State Warriors are. And of course the franchise is getting sort of a renaissance now with Stephen Curry and some other guys because they're obviously, at this point in time, the best team in the NBA league-wise. But they've had Baron Davis. He led the franchise for a while. They had Run TMC in the 90s, and they're a great franchise. Hard to argue with them not being in the top 10.
Definitely. And they were one of the teams that they did have an overall losing record. They were dominant for a very long time, and now with the Steph Curry and group they have now, I think they'll be good for quite some time. But they did have that, those long stretches where they wouldn't be very competitive, and they'd have, losing season records. And so that kind of spaced them apart a little bit from the next team on our list. But yeah, I mean, 3 championships is good. I mean, 6 finals appearances, that's not very easy to do. As you'll continue to see in our list, that's one of the most ever, aside from like the top 2, which we'll get to later on in the list. But it's a pretty impressive franchise.
Definitely.
All right, so number 7, and this was I was a little bit disappointed at this team was as low. I wanted them to be in the top 5.
Yeah.
And really, I think both of us wanted them to be number 4 all time.
Yeah.
But because, like I said, we try to be as objective. Well, I guess I should say which team it is. The number 7 team are the San Antonio Spurs. And I'm obviously not a big Spurs fan because I remember early in the 2000s, Shaq versus Duncan. There's a little bit of a rivalry there. But I like the franchise. They're classy. And I think, against Tim Duncan, one of the greatest players of all time. So, and I wanted them to be maybe 5 or 4, but I think one of the things that hurt them was when they merged with the NBA. They haven't been around quite as long as some of the other teams we'll mention, after we talk about the Spurs. But I mean, they were one of the few teams in our point system that was able to get up to 9,000 points. So they had 9,038 total points. But obviously, they've had a lot of success since the late 90s. 5 championships, 6 finals appearances. They've made it to the playoffs 33 times. And now, I guess what hurt them was that they didn't have, since they weren't around as long, they didn't win as many regular season games. So just under 1,900 regular season games won. But one of the big intangible things that really helped them give them a lot of points was that since the Duncan era and Popovich era, they've been, for the last 17, 18 years, every year that they're going to win a lot of games, that you can't discount them in the playoffs. They're always going to make some noise, and not very many franchises and teams have been able to do that, win for such a long period of time.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah. So that's...
Yeah, when I think of the San Antonio Spurs, obviously there's all the success, but I think a term that comes to mind is inclusion. They're the first team to have a female assistant coach.
Sure.
Their franchise has had a lot of players from different nationalities and different countries. Popovich is a class act.
They play really good team ball. There really aren't very many selfish guys. Like Manu Ginobili, for example, an amazing player. He'd be a starter on pretty much any team.
Yeah.
But he has been willing to, for as long as I can remember, sacrifice his individual statistics for the good of the team. And I think that's one of the best things that this franchise has been able to, for the last decade and a half, been able to show the world how classy they are and win.
Yeah, definitely. It takes a special type of player to be a Manu Ginobili because you're extremely talented. You would be a starter on any other team in the league, but you come off the bench to give them an offensive boost. And there's very few players that...
Been on the all-star team, too, many
exactly.
times. He's an all-star.
To be able to put your ego aside and do that is something special. Not to go on my own tangent here, but to me, one of the all players who ultimately sacrificed was Scottie Pippen because he was so talented, and no matter what he does, you're always going to take a back seat to Michael Jordan. It's just the way it is. Doesn't matter who you are.
Right.
But yeah, back to Manu Ginobili. He definitely sacrificed for that team. Tony Parker, I'm sure he'll be a Hall of Famer. And of course, Tim Duncan is one of the greatest players of all time.
And David Robinson, of course.
And David Robinson is the Admiral is actually my personal favorite Spur of all time. He's a great player. A lot of these players, I think, especially in the 90s, maybe don't get the credit they deserve because they went up against... There was just so much competition in the 90s. And David Robinson was amazing.
Well, yeah, and he and Duncan also were able to beat, Kobe and Shaq and end their three-peat.
Yeah.
Because in 2003 was, I think, the last year that he played, and he and Tim Duncan, ended the Shaq and Kobe's, run or attempt to get the fourth, right? So that, he definitely deserves a lot of credit. He's one of the, maybe their second best after Duncan player. And you can make the argument maybe it's Parker, but, for me personally, I like the Admiral a little bit more than Tony, but
Yeah, David Robinson is so good. He actually scored.
71 in a
It was
game.
71.
Yeah.
And the big knock against that is people said they're going for the record and it was against a bad team. Well, when these guys have historic numbers,
Yeah.
when are they not going for the record and when is it not against a bad team? So I don't think that's a fair knock. But before we switch franchise whenever here, also just have to mention George the Iceman Gervin, great player. Obviously didn't have, the championship caliber teams that they did later on, but he was a great player. Definitely a very special Spur.
Sure, and anytime you get like 50, 60, 70, between that 71, that doesn't matter even if it's against a bad team. That's still difficult to do.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, there's a lot of players in this league, in the NBA who would love to be able to get 71 against the worst team in the league.
Or even 51
yeah.
is not easy to get.
Exactly.
Right. So I guess we'll move on to the...
And just to clarify, a lot of players in the league, if you can average more than 20 points a game, you're considered an all-star. So Robinson more than tripled that number in one game.
Right.
And another thing you got to take in consideration is he's a center. So big men do not shoot threes. And obviously when you shoot a lot of threes, it helps you get more points. So he got to that number without shooting threes.
Sure, definitely. Number 6.
My lucky number, we have the Detroit Pistons, not my favorite team, but a great team from the Motor City. They ended up with 9,380 points, 3 championships, 7 finals appearances, 40 playoff appearances, and 2,540 regular season games. It's obviously just a great franchise, a lot of basketball history there. Most notably, the Bad Boys in the 80s.
Yep.
But
Jordan rules.
Yeah, they're just a great team. They prove that team play wins championships. And you had to do ultimate.
Tough defense.
Tough defense, too.
Yeah.
And they had to do that against the legendary players, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan. So they definitely didn't have an easy route.
Right.
And they were led by the great Isaiah Thomas.
Sure. Yeah, because we were actually just talking about this. I watched a good documentary about the Bad Boy Pistons. I think you can still find it on Netflix. But yeah, I mean, if you really think about it, because everyone remembers the 80s for the Lakers Celtics rivalry, and they, rightfully so, both of those franchises won the most amount of championships. But
Yeah.
And then of course the 90s, Jordan took over. But for that short period of time, you had a team that was able to not just win once, but repeat and go through them, because in order for Detroit to be able to make it to the finals, they had to get past Boston. And then when they did make it past Boston finally, they had to go against the Lakers and Magic Johnson after they beat Larry Bird.
That's tough.
Yeah. And then as soon as Larry Bird left, oh, what do you get? You get a little break? Nope. You have to get past Michael Jordan. So it was really tough. So you have to, give them a lot of respect, and that's why in that intangibles category, we gave them the full points, because again, one of the few franchises that have been able to repeat. They won 2 in a row, but I think their repeat in a way, could be some of the hardest because of who they had to get past to do it.
Unquestionably.
And then of course the other thing is the part of that intangibles was the Bad Boy Pistons and that image. Maybe the rest of the NBA hated them, but Detroit loved them, right? Anybody who was a big fan of that 80s, 90s tough physical NBA, I don't think there was anyone more physical and tough than these guys.
The way they played in the 80s, basketball will never be played again. And they, back in the old days, you took a pounding when you entered the lane. There was no... the NBA nowadays, obviously, they've tightened up on the rules.
The Pistons, the Bad Boy Pistons, you didn't get a pounding, you got a beating.
And I don't want to knock the league, because they did, for very understandable reasons, which is another podcast in itself, they tightened the rules up, had to clean up the image, and can't let them do some of the physical things they used to do. But the way they played, every single night, it's old school basketball at its best.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I can understand that. And like you said, we can definitely talk about that more as another topic. But if you think about it, when you play so physical and so tough, it makes it easier to injure players.
Yeah.
And what if, we had an unfortunate situation where, Jordan had, for example, a career-ending injury, and we wouldn't have gotten to see him play. So I can understand why they wanted to make it less like that and more the way that it is now.
What's really interesting about Michael Jordan, and yeah, we're going to go on a lot of tangents throughout these podcasts, but he had a clause in his contract, a love for the game clause, so he could play pickup games anywhere. And he played in the physical era, the 80s, played in the off-season, and somehow had a long, lucrative career where he had no major injuries. That's pretty amazing.
Well, he did early on in his career.
He had a foot injury, but I think he even came back that year in the playoffs, if memory serves me correct. But before we move on, I'm just going to throw out there, in the 90s, Grant Hill was a great player, and he's one of those players who...
Yeah, for Detroit.
Injury took away some of his career.
Right.
He had a career resurgence extremely late in his career with Steve Nash, and they didn't have the team success that maybe they wanted, but individually, statistically, he had great stats. And he's a great player, and my ears stick out a little bit. So anytime you got a guy whose ears stick out a little bit, you got to have his back. So,
all right, we'll move on. So the next franchise, number 5 on our list, are the New York Knicks. There is the New York Knicks. They just edged out Detroit, and they had 9,404 total points. And what really, separated the Knicks out was a little bit from Detroit, I guess, is they did have 1 championship less. They only had 2 championships, but 8 finals appearances. And a few more playoff appearances, 42. And they won more regular season games with 2,652. And that kind of helped them edge out a little bit. And I think New York probably would have had more championships, but I think a lot of times they did meet the Lakers in the finals. They squared off against them many times and, got the short end of the stick. But still, like we said, to make it to the finals 8 times is a big accomplishment, and that's one of the big things that made them one of the best franchises. MJ can talk more about the great players, but I guess I wanted to talk about what, as far as the intangibles, why we gave them full points here is, you're get to play in New York, one of the greatest cities on earth. Anytime you get to play for some of these big cities, that's a plus. Just to say that I'm a franchise in New York is a big thing. And, they had a lot of great games against Jordan and the Bulls in the 90s, and they were competitive for quite a long time. And then I think what hurt them a little bit, and I think it was the same for Detroit, both of those franchises, unfortunately, have an overall losing record when you look at their numbers. So that's what kind of hurt them from getting the number 4 spot, which we'll talk about that franchise shortly, but if they didn't, it would have been an even closer race between our number 4 team. But MJ can talk about some of the great players that they had. I mean, obviously Patrick Ewing and Sprewell, but...
Yeah, I mean, one thing about the New York Knicks, whether they've been good or bad, they've always had good players. Sometimes they've just had bad luck with good players. More recently, they've had Steve Francis, relatively recently, talking 10-year span here. Starberry?
Yeah,
Stephon Marbury. Starberry. He's got a shoe line, I think it's Starberry or something like that. I'm not going to look that up. But Allen Houston, Latrell Sprewell.
Carmelo Anthony now.
Carmelo Anthony, yeah. But
don't get him started by Anthony.
But yeah, when you talk about like the glory days of the Knicks, there's the 90s, which was they're sort of the 90s version of the bad boy Detroit Pistons. Patrick Ewing anchoring the middle. And then, of course, you had the great 70s team with one of the most probably underrated players of all time, Willis Reed. And people just love the New York Knicks. No matter if they're good or bad, people love them. Understandably so, it's New York. They're in the legendary Madison Square Garden. And
everyone, when they play in New York, whatever team it is, right, they always want to play a little bit harder there. Because you're playing in the Big Apple.
Yeah.
Jordan scoring 60 points.
Oh, yeah.
Right, against them,
Yeah, some of the greatest memories in the Madison Square Garden, NBA-wise, are other teams.
Right.
scoring against the Knicks.
Sure, but being watching your team play and you being able to experience that, even if you're not, even if you're rooting for the Knicks, to be able to see, like Kobe, right, a few years ago, he scored 61 points there. Getting to see that is still pretty cool. So that's another plus. Might not be good for them if they lose, but but still.
For me personally, like, just watching great players do great things.
As a fan.
Yeah, as a fan, even if my team loses, if I'm a Michael Jordan fan, so that's a bad example. But if I get to watch, like, Shaq with the Lakers just have one of the greatest games of his career, it's just amazing to watch. So I think as a New York Knicks fan, even though some of the highlights might have been against the Knicks, it's still amazing to have those things happen in Madison Square Garden.
Right.
And that concludes part 1 of the inaugural episode of The Beat. I'm MJ, and this is BD, and stay tuned for part 2.